This is the second vid on doing some parallel processing. There's a couple things. This is parallel processing a little bit more complex rather than just the basic understanding and basic usage of parallel processing. Some of the concepts can get very, very complicated. One thing that you'll see is I'm not really addressing using different buses and sends and routing things in some circular thing where they're coming back around and feeding into each other and doing all that kind of stuff. Sometimes that stuff can be really cool, and sometimes it can just become just a mess. I mean, if you really spend your time messing with that kind of stuff, sometimes you can do some really cool stuff. But if you try to come at it and keep it as simple as possible for what you want to do, when you're just trying to get something done, when you're really trying to paint and sculpt and do something with these colors, and you've got this palette, and it's more of an artistic thing, then the more time you spend on that, the better. I mean, you can have some kind of parallel process chain where it processes out to Mars and comes back and goes through NASA and then goes to the Pentagon and then, through the $1 billion computer in China and comes back and whatever, I mean, if you're having fun in it and it's doing some cool stuff for you, more power to you, dude. That's part of it. I mean, the concept can be the same a lot as even creating music, because you're creating just like it's not that different from creating music. But you can get lost in it if you're not that type of an artist, messing with it. So if you're not, and you're not that type of an artist that wants to, loop it back into this send and back to this other bus going into this other send and all over the dang place, and you're just, you're so into the coloring and the artistry involved. If you're not into that, be real careful you don't get lost in that, think that you just suck or don't know what you're doing just because you spend, every waking moment, messing with that. But the concept here is one of the first concepts after on the second bid was that blending all that parallel processing into a clean channel. So in this parallel chain here, that you can see I've got a clean channel coming out over here. That's a real basic concept to understand, because if you watch the last video and you've done all this parallel processing, and then you're going to go ahead because you've had this cut off, and you're working on those. And now that you've got those blended really good, and you want to try to blend that into the original, like, percent of a mix, that you're putting into there. And starting to blend that into the original because you're trying to preserve something from the original or something like that. There can be a lot of reasons why you want to preserve some of the original to blend in with it. Sometimes not at all. You just want to toss that original. You want to, build it, does that make sense? But sometimes not. Sometimes then it's good to have a clean off to the side and try to blend it in a little bit. Maybe because of something that's happening and it might get lost in the processing. That's a real simple concept to understand, but one of the first complexities that you run into is you have that clean channel that you're going to try to blend all that other work you've done into that clean channel, which may make you go back here and have to start working on all the different blues that you are working on. And, that can be very complex. So that's the first complexity that you run into. The second complexity that you can run into lots of complexities, but I'm going to just address a couple simple ones because they're the major complexities. That one is a huge complexity. It doesn't sound like that much, but when all of a sudden you click on that clean channel and you've done all this work and you might have 4 or 5 different, sets of compression or sets of parallel processing that you've done some really cool work with, and it doesn't sound too bad, but then you start blending it in with that original that's clean, and all of a sudden, oh wait, what happened? And you happen to go back and, start doing work, blending those different ones in to the clean one, which can get very, 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 very complex. Sometimes really super complex. But the concept is simple. Keep this concept simple that you're trying to blend, preserve some of the original part of the audio, that there was something cool about it that you don't want to completely lose, that you want to blend in with some other work that you've done. It's that simple. Don't let it get any more complicated than that. You can get very complex, but that's the basic concept of what you're trying to do. The next thing is when you're doing parallel processing is sometimes, here's a real simple example, is that Now this could be with anything. So you're doing this with, you've got a flanger here and a phaser here, or some type of delay here and some type of reverb over here. It doesn't really matter what the processor is, because the concept's the same, is that you're going to work on one going into the other to shape that blue before you start trying to parallel process it against something else. And it's that simple, but that can be hugely complex, because you start getting into stuff, and I've gotten into it, and I'd be sitting there and I have this parallel chain with processes all over the place, and I'll be trying to save it as a preset, and I'll be like, oh dude, I got 500 processes on here. And, you know, and it's like, sometimes it can get more complex than it needs to be, and a lot of times I'll try to keep, when I do this, I will do like compression, and parallel gating, expanding, parallel flanging, parallel, you know, delays, I try to keep them separate. So I end up with some kind of mess, you know, that I've got all these processors all over the place. But sometimes it's cool. Sometimes if you're really artistic, that you can really do some really cool stuff. You figure out that you just put this reverb on here and it went into this really trippy delay, and you put this gate on it, you know, and then, wow, dude, well, that was really cool, dude. And then I, you know, parallel it against this other gate, you know, with this other expansion limiter expander thing against this channel strip, against the screen track. Wow. You know, and sometimes it can go like that. Sometimes it can just turn into a mess, and you just be like going, oh, dude, you know, that just sucks. I don't know what to do. But if you take it one step at a time, that you're working with this, and then you're working with that to try to blend it into that, and then you're working with that to blend it into this and the other one step at a time, and then go back after you've made it all, to come back in the process and fine tune them so that that last blue color that you worked on is really cool. Does that make sense? But that concept is the second concept that you come into that can be very difficult and very complex, that you start trying to mix processors on, you know, it's in series processing. So you've got that compressor running that gate, or that flanger running into that, you know, that delay, or that reverb running into that, you know, that phaser, or whatever you happen to do, or, you know, some other type of filter, or 3 or 4 of them maybe, because you're trying to sculpt this sound really cool, but then you want to parallel it against this gate, and then you want to do some, you know, that kind of stuff can get real complex, and be very, very careful about that. Worry about that one step at a time. If you really got this sound coming in here, and you've got, like, you know, you want to compress a little bit before it goes to this gate, you know, and then you're going to parallel it against that other gate. Really work on that. Understand one step at a time, so you don't get just lost in it. Does that make sense? And the same thing with other things, that you've got a little bit of reverb really makes this delay sound cool. And you've got this, you know, impulse response against this delay, or in series with this delay, that makes this really cool blue sound, dude, right? And then you're going to, you know, parallel it against this other delay, or the same kind of delay that came out sound a little bit differently, was doing something else you wanted to do, and then you're trying to combine them together. And that's the second complexity that you run into a lot of times with parallel processing. But those concepts are really simple. And if you go back to the last vid and understand that before you watch this vid, and kind of get them in your head, those two things. You can do lots of things with parallel processing. The problem is you'll find that the less processing you do, the better. Sometimes, but when you're really artistic, sometimes a lot of processing just to do some really cool stuff, and you know, mixing these 2 blues that you've made, or these 3 or 4 blues that you put together to come out with this really cool effect, or this sound, that's something cool, dude. I mean, that's just as cool almost as coming up with a riff or a hook for your chorus, you know. I mean, it's that type of thing, and it really can be. But just be careful of that you don't get lost in that. That first concept of trying to blend it in with the original, don't get lost in that. Understand the basic concept of what I was saying there, because that's all you're dealing with. It's that simple and that basic. And the next thing you run into is running, you know, processors in series, and then paralleling them against other things, like you did, like I was showing you in the first video, that now you've taken it to a whole different level. and you've got this, instead of like in their video that you're just making this blue over here that's cool. It's a cool blue. It's not less than this blue or anything, but it's cool, and then you're going to parallel it against this blue again with this other blue and this other blue. Well, with this one, you've complex, now that you're dealing with painting, you've got this titanium white, and you're adding some, a little bit of different white to it, then it's like that kind of concept. You're making it more complex. And be careful. The biggest issue with those in series going against parallel processing or mixing them is that you really understand your processors. What is it happening when you mix that reverb and that delay? Because reverb and delay are along the same conceptual lines of what they do. And if you mix them in series, they can do some really cool stuff. And then if you take that and you've made this really cool, color blue from this reverb and this delay, and then you're paralleling it against this other delay that's this same delay but set up a little bit differently, this other cool effect, and then you're trying to mix them together, it just gets more complex. And the biggest thing to remember about that is just don't get lost in it, one step at a time. And then when you start trying to parallel it, that you're really looking at a spectroscope and on a scope and listening to it and looking at it and what it's doing and how it's affecting that. And those kind of processing chains will drastically affect different types of instruments differently. So keep that in mind, that you put up this really cool processing chain that goes from here to China, and it works great on that tom, but on that guitar, it ain't flying no how, no way, and it's like, and don't get bummed by that. And it's like, the more complex you make it, the more specific its target is going to be. Does that make sense? Like, you've done all this compress, all this parallel, and series processing for this drum, and you're just, that's it, dude. Oh yeah. But that's what it's for. It's not going to work really well on that other thing. It might not even work well on your tom or something like that. And that can get very, very complex. So try not to get lost in that. But those are the two other issues when you're doing parallel processing that you'll run into. And if you can get a handle on those and understand that you're trying to go against that or trying to blend that with the original sound for some reason, some kind of tonal qualities in it, and why you would want to even save it, and being able to preserve those and blend them with all that other cool stuff you've done. That sounds simple, but that's not simple. I mean, it's complex. And being able to hear the differences, you'd be sitting there with headphones on and really super listening to what's going on. And, one thing to remember about that is that I'll see people get into that, and then they'll try to put something they spent just weeks on, and they're trying to blend it into this mix, and all that shit they did is lost in the mix because the mix is so full. Try to remember that, because you can do tons of work and all of a sudden they just get lost in the mix. It's like, you'd have done the same thing with just a little bit of reverb, then all that parallel processing you did with all those delays is just lost, because it's not a prominent, it's not the prominent out front, instrument. So it got, all that stuff got lost and blended into the mix, and it was a waste of time. That can happen. So don't get bummed about that and realize, oh, well, that's not going to work unless it's out front, because all that shit's just going to get lost. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. On that bass drum, it might not. On that guitar in your face, it might not. But that guitar played out in the background, and you did all that work for nothing, because it's lost. You can't hear it. It doesn't sound any different than if you stuck a couple reverbs in parallel, and you're like, oh, dude, that sucks. But that can be real, so really understand that. So those two issues I wanted to address. Take your time with that. When you're first doing that parallel processing, follow those, follow that from the first video and those concepts. Then work on trying to blend that in with the other, static audio, and why you'd want to do that. Why you'd want to do that. That's the concept. And the other thing is when you start doing, processors in series against paralleling. That concept. Why would you want to mix that reverb and that delay, or that flanger and that phaser, and then parallel it against another phaser or some delay? Why would you want to do that? And sometimes it's just experimental and you're having fun. But sometimes, you just one thing at a time, and then worry about trying to blend it in and what it's doing. And if you can get a handle on those three concepts from these two videos, that you'll have a pretty good understanding, even if you run into a lot of different ways to do it. So I certainly hope that helps you a lot, and peace, hope, love.